Harriet. Thank you very much for joining me today. Just to sort of discuss what you're seeing going on in the industry. So from our perspective, everybody I talk to is saying that they are absolutely bonkers busy, and there are so many new deals being signed, so many extension of deals being signed. It'd be really interesting to get your perspective on what you're now seeing in the industry.
Well, firstly, thanks for asking me to come on today, Kerry. It's always a pleasure to talk to GSA. So first up, I think the view that you just expressed about the market is definitely in line with what we're seeing. A lot of deals which are actually quite sizable and complex. So it's not just renewals or rollovers of existing deals, but people trying to do some quite interesting things. So that's great. And for those of us who are involved in the sourcing industry, it's great that we are all busy. In terms of why that might be, I think partially it's probably driven by people needing to adjust their models to respond to what the coronavirus has done. I think, though, the imperative of digital transformation and the reacting to the capabilities of things like AI and robotic process automation are still there. So none of those drivers have actually gone away, and if anything, may have been slightly sped up. So we see a lot of outsourcing deals, probably a growth, if anything, in business process outsourcing, as opposed to perhaps some of the traditional IT-related deals. So a lot of digital transformation, a lot of agile-led projects, and a lot that's been driven by cloud. So in particular, not just cloud in terms of having a backbone or an element in the supply chain, which is enabled by cloud, but more what I would call enterprise cloud deals. So the very largest platform as a service, infrastructure as a service type deals, where the entirety of people's operations are being shifted into predominantly public cloud environments now, which is a trend which we've been seeing for some years, but it's noticeably accelerated over the course of the last 24 months, I would say.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So we did an event, must be a couple of years ago now, so it's when we were still doing events, and it was all about cloud economics. And I think the summary from that was very much that people were doing cloud, but they were keeping their legacy playing at the same time. So it's kind of like parallel processing, and in fact, the entire cost of their infrastructure was going up. Is that changing now? Have people got the courage to turn purely onto cloud?
Well, I think your use of the word courage, I think, is a particularly appropriate one, Kerry, because I think there is an element of people being nervous about putting all of their eggs in the public cloud basket. But I think that definitely is changing. So if you went back a few years, there was this hesitation, particularly from heavily regulated clients like financial services, of going into the public cloud at all. There was concern of, well, is it secure? Do I feel comfortable with my data potentially being put into an environment with other people's data? How will my regulators feel? How will my customers even feel? That Rubicon was crossed, probably again 18 months, 2 years ago. But people were still nervous. There was still this kind of sense of, well, I know it should be okay, but is it really? And maybe I should at least have a fallback where either some of my critical applications are kept on premise, or at least I have the capability to move them back on prem. Some clients still like that comfort blanket, but increasingly we are seeing clients say, look, if I'm going to have a fallback at all, probably the fallback is to have another cloud vendor lined up, ready to go, and splitting my loads across 2 vendors rather than just appointing one at the get-go. But certainly there's a palpable increase in the confidence that people feel in moving away from the need to have legacy IT and legacy infrastructure waiting around just on the off chance that they need it.
And do you think that's happened because of obviously moving to virtual workforce environments during the pandemic? It's given them that level of confidence that this tech actually does work?
I'm sure that's a very significant part of it. I think that it's proved that it is scalable, that it can be spun up and then spun down very quickly. So obviously the move for working remotely was a big part of that, but equally the digital transformation agenda, where people need to move at incredibly high speeds, has, I think, been a real supercharger for the move into the cloud, because the only way that people can spin up those kind of development environments, as may be required by the business teams, is to have the capability to go to a cloud vendor rather than having to do some internal negotiation with an IT team as to within what kind of time frame could they obtain some additional infrastructure and when could they fit it into their data center, etc. So there's been that business push to enable the provision of IT power and capacity much faster than it was hitherto the case.
Okay, so what sort of deals are you negotiating on, and what sort of deals are you being signed, and what sort of room is there for negotiation on cloud? So again, historically, the conversations I'd have would be, you've just got to take AWS's or Google's terms, and that is it. There was no room for negotiation. Is that changing?
Yes, it is, to at least some extent. But I think the first thing to note is that when people talk about cloud services, it's a bit like saying, well, all doctors are the same, all lawyers are the same. In reality, there are lots of different flavors of cloud deals. So it's very important at the outset that we identify what type of cloud deal we're talking about. Because at one end of the scale, you might be talking about SaaS agreements where there's a huge degree of variability between some providers who are absolutely dead set on their terms applying and others who are willing to negotiate on the basis of the customer's paper. Then you move into kind of cloud service providers who don't necessarily have their own capacity but are offering a kind of private cloud or hybrid cloud solution. They're like players of the likes of IBM and Atos and Capgemini, for example, in that space. And they will negotiate on the basis that that's their heritage as kind of IT service and outsource providers. They've always been willing to negotiate. And then further up to the right-hand side of the scale, you've got what we would call the hyperscalers. So Microsoft, AWS, Google in particular, those three players who've been phenomenally successful in building up their market share. And yes, I think it's true that because of the strength of their offerings and their commercials, they have been able historically to avoid too much in the way of contract negotiation and position things on the basis that their offering reflects the contract terms which they put forward to their customers. But I think it's true that there is more scope for negotiation now than there had previously been, partially driven through regulators and some of their requirements, partially driven through the competitive posture in the marketplace with those three providers and others all competing increasingly hard for exciting and large projects. And I would say also because as projects increase in size and complexity and business criticality, obviously customers put more attention to what kind of contract terms they are negotiating, engage both internal and external lawyers more than they might hitherto have done, and that also puts a lot more pressure upon the negotiation process and chips away at what kind of contract terms might then become negotiable.
Right, so what sort of contract terms have you been able to negotiate? Can you give us some examples of any projects that you've recently been working on where you've had some wins?
Yes, so I mean, some of them are you might call the usual suspects, so things like liability clauses, liability limits, which are inherently negotiable. I mean, that ultimately isn't so much a matter of legal right or wrong, it's just a question of negotiability. I think what's more interesting is the degree of latitude that some of the providers may show in terms of some of the provisions which they may have justified historically on the basis of it being, this is how our model works. So things like the right to make modifications to the services, the right to suspend the services, and the right to change some of the contract terms that might have applied. And the historic justification for those types of provisions was that if in order to fit in with the one-to-many service model. So the idea being, if I as a cloud provider need to make a change to my solution in order to reflect the requirements of the market, I can't be held back in making that change just because one customer who's accessing that service, that solution, doesn't like what I'm going to do. You have to just trust the cloud provider that it's only going to make changes which are for the benefit of the entire customer base. What we are seeing, however, is that now that as we get into these negotiations and there's more money at stake and therefore more competitive pressure, it is possible to negotiate at least some degree of guardrails for the exercise of those provisions. So things like how much notice can be given, whether improvement with adjustments to the services must always be positive, or whether if you remove some element of functionality, it has to be replaced with something else, or whether the customer themselves gets some right to either exit from the deal if they don't agree with the changes that have been made, or have some adjustment to the economics behind it, be that in relation to some kind of minimum revenue commitment or similar, all to reflect the fact that the customer may end up in a position which is other than that which it had intended to be in when the contract was signed. So it's those types of provisions now which you know, hitherto, I think some of the cloud providers have had very beneficial provisions, and now perhaps are being a bit more tested through the negotiation process.
Interesting. So are you aware of any challenges having been made against any of the cloud providers? Is there any case law coming through, or is that far too soon?
Not case law as yet, and I think we are probably too soon in the process for those types of provisions to be tested out in terms of whether it's reasonableness or interpretation in terms of ambiguity. But it will happen. I mean, if we need to look at how in the outsourcing world, you know, we have had periodically some interesting precedents come through. So earlier on this year, for example, in the UK, we had the Cisgill and IBM case, which is all about a failed transformation stroke outsourcing agreement. And it had lots of very interesting case law in that about, you know, interpretation of goodwill and interpretation of liability clauses, etc. But those cases come around relatively rarely, because not only does something have to go wrong, but the parties also need to litigate it, and it needs to actually get to court. Whereas in reality, you know, well north of 90% of disputes get settled without ever getting to court. So we'll need to be quite patient and possibly even quite lucky before we get really good case law to interpret how these clauses might work.
Okay, cool. So we've got 3 hyperscalers at the moment. Do you think there are going to be more added to that list, or is there opportunity for some of the players to take more market share from the existing 3?
There's certainly capacity to do it, and there are a number of factors which I think are encouraging that. So on one hand, if you look at the EU, for example, the EU authorities are almost foaming at the mouth in the hope that a European challenger will emerge, which is something which they've been very public about in some of their pronouncements, but hasn't yet occurred. So that's one possibility, which is that the Europeans put their weight behind encouraging a European player to rise up to challenge. We have got a deal at the moment where Huawei are counter bidding against the 3 normal hyperscalers, which was a new one on me, I have to say. Obviously, Alibaba is another potential player for China, and has got boundless ambitions ultimately to move outside of the Chinese market. But then you can see the potential geopolitical challenges that may raise. I find it difficult to see at the moment another commercial organization, be it like an IBM or even something like a Facebook, making a play to become a true hyperscaler in the public cloud space, because they've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of the building up of the capacity that Google, Microsoft, and AWS have. So certainly for the West and for the near future, I think those 3 are truly dominant. And if I was to be a betting man, if a customer was to be coming to me to say, we've got a negotiation with a hyperscaler or a process to appoint a hyperscaler, I would place a large bet that those 3 would be on the shortlist.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting the stuff you were saying about obviously the role for potential for China, but also potential for a European player. I guess, how many of the deals that you're doing are truly global by their nature, and what are the challenges of doing these deals globally?
Well, it may be partially just due to the footprint that DLA have, or even the kind of clients and projects that I do, but certainly the hyperscale projects that I've done in recent times have all been global. It's just in order to make the economics work on the size, they just almost inevitably are. Now, aside from just the size and value of that, which brings its own tension to the negotiation process, the kind of additional issues that it throws up tend to revolve around data localization, and the challenges of navigating through the data protection landscape. And the others is largely to do with sanctions and embargoes. So there is a constant underlying challenge of the extent to which the US sanctions regime might apply to cloud service providers who have their domiciles in the US, because of the possibility that they could then be, that their provision of cloud services could be seen as facilitating the operations of any of their customers, who are then dealing with anybody who may, a one step removed, be subject to US sanctions. So that then throws a bit of a challenge for organizations who are themselves global, but who would not hitherto have seen themselves as being directly subject to US sanction regimes.
God, that's a minefield, isn't it? So, so what would be your clear 3 main pieces of advice to anybody, you know, entering a significant cloud agreement?
So, for first bit of advice is definitely to be clear on what type of cloud you're dealing with, because as I mentioned earlier on, there are lots of different flavors, and some of them are much more negotiable than others. The second bit of advice I would have is, if you are at the hyperscale end of the scale, then do be realistic about how much you will actually be able to get to change in the contracts. Yes, there is some negotiability, but you know, you do need to be realistic about how far you will be able to get hyperscale vendors to shift away from what has been a very successful business model for them to date. The third thing I would say is, do think about the commercials, which go beyond just the obvious legal provisions. So things like minimum revenue commitments, things like the migration services, things like the ensuring of continuity of service beyond a notional date determination. These are all things that can really matter to the business going forward, and where there is a lot more scope to come up with terms which are specific to this particular project.
So obviously, we are actually, not obviously, I'll just share this though, we are celebrating our 35th anniversary next year. So obviously the industry, the outsourcing industry, has got a whole host of history for what sort of deals can be signed and what the price tags are against those deals. And obviously the vast majority have been really done on, you know, FTE sort of models. How does anybody know they are, when they're negotiating their first really major cloud deal, that they are batting in the right area, they're not being completely ripped off, they're not paying massively over the odds or negotiating something absolutely ridiculous into their contracts? You know, is there a body somewhere that they can go to understand that they're doing this vaguely right?
Yeah, well, obviously the market is nowhere near as mature as the outsourcing market is more generally. So the outsourcing market, you'd always been able to look at the type of organizations who would typically offer benchmark services, and who've got a welter of data which could be used to give you some comfort that, notwithstanding the competitive procurement process you may have gone through, at the end of the day you were ending up in the right ballpark. There isn't as yet that same kind of benchmark community out there, but we're getting there very quickly. What you do have, and this is publicly available from most of the large-scale hyperscalers, is their standard prices. So you'll be able to see what their standard rate card is for a particular type of instance made available and from a particular type of geo. But all of the hyperscalers only use that as the basis for negotiation, depending upon how large a deal you have, what the duration of the deal will be, and what the size of your minimum revenue commitment might be. So all of that becomes negotiable. I think what it does emphasize, though, is the need to engage with appropriate external experts, be they legal or procurement consultants, as early on in the process as you can, because they are then the people within the sourcing world who will be able to tell you, within the bounds of confidentiality, what kind of price points or commitments have been achieved within the wider market. So in this market in particular, there's probably never been a better argument in favour of getting the right people involved early on.
Well, that is the sourcing best practice that we've always been preaching from the GSA. So yeah, hopefully people will be doing that when there's so much, obviously at stake. So yep. Crystal ball time, Kit. How do you see this whole area of enterprise cloud negotiations, contracting changing over the next 5 years?
Well, that's a good question.
How would you like it to change? If you
well, how I would like it to change, how it will change, two different questions. Yeah. I don't see any slowdown in the growth of the use of cloud services. If anything, I think it will accelerate. So I think IT infrastructure outsourcing in its traditional form is already withering on the vine, and I suspect it will largely die before the end of that 5-year period. So good news for the the hyperscalers and large scale cloud providers is that they are definitely on the winning side in terms of the growth of services. I would be willing to make a bet that those cloud providers, particularly again the hyperscalers, will gradually extend their service offerings so that rather than just saying, well, we're a platform for other people to load services on top of it, they'll start thinking, well, why don't I actually provide the services as well? So, and it would be a very interesting move if one or other of the hyperscalers were to acquire somebody who had a SaaS type offering or an outsourced service offering to be put on top of their existing platform and tin. So that might well be an area of development for them, because obviously there's a lot of revenue that could be gained in that regard. I suspect that from the point of view of the process, and particularly the negotiation process, that there will be a continuing evolution of what is negotiable and what emerges as kind of market standards, which at the moment are still very much in flux. And I suspect that we will unfortunately continue to face challenges in terms of conflicts of laws, because there are lots of political factors at play as opposed to just commercial ones. And I don't see, for example, the US authorities blacking down anytime soon in terms of their application of things like the US Cloud Act, any more than I see the European Commission and backing down in terms of the extraterritorial impact of GDPR. So we'll still have that challenge of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object, and people just to an extent at least just turning a blind eye to it and hoping that they won't be the ones impacted when the authorities really want to bare their teeth in terms of that challenge.
Right, now this might be a bit of a nasty question. So if you were advising DLA Piper, would you advise DLA Piper to go purely into the cloud with one service provider at this time?
Probably not with one. We do have lots of cloud services these days. I think most law firms, even though we are as an industry conservative with a small c, though all of us have seen the safety and actually the improvement in security that comes around through engaging with cloud providers. But my own personal view is, even if you're going 80% capacity wise with one provider, to come back to your point about the security blanket of having legacy IT, I do see there's a business continuity play to having a second vendor, not just set up in terms of contracts, but also having at least some of your capacity already set up, so that it would facilitate a more rapid switch across if the need arose. So best practice, I would think, particularly for larger organizations, would be to have at least one warm standby provider, even if most of your requirements is with one of the others.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So any last pieces of advice you'd like to impart on this subject?
No, I think again, come back to your points about the three things to keep in mind. I would say be realistic, give yourself time, because even though you may not think there is as much negotiation as may have been the case with a traditional outsource, there is still a lot to be got through, and it can take a long time to get through. And just remember that it is different, and therefore your mindset about what achieved the process may also be different. So lawyers, for example, we may be less focused upon amending the contract terms and more focused upon assessment of risk and mitigating strategies. So it's a different mindset that you need to bring to the negotiation and procurement process.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today. And yes, I know you're fully available to anybody that wants to talk enterprise cloud.
Super stuff. Well, thanks again for asking me.
Okay, cheers.